In this video, let's create a special type of middleware called Param Middleware. So Param Middleware is middleware that only runs for certain parameters. So basically, when we have a certain parameter in our URL. Now in our example here, the only parameter that we might have in our route URL is the ID, right? And so we can now write middleware that only runs when this ID is present in a URL. Okay, so let me show you how to do it. It is quite simple actually. So it's on our router and then the param method. Okay, and so here we specify first the parameter that we actually want to search for. So basically the parameter for which this middleware is going to run, and it's called ID. And then of course our actual middleware function. Okay. And as usual, we have access to the request and to the response object, and then, since it's a middleware function, also to the next function, right? Now, in a param middleware function, we actually get access to a fourth argument, and that one is the value of the parameter in question. Okay, so we usually call that one val, which stands for value. Okay, and so now we can go ahead and simply log it to the console just to take a look if this actually works. So let's say tour ID is, and then ID, right? Next up, we also have to call next, right? Because otherwise the request response cycle will get stuck in this middleware function and it's not going to be able to move on to the next middleware in the stack, right? Which are going to be these routes down here. All right. So let's give it a save and check it out now. And we want it to not forget all users, but for forget one tour, right? Now let me show you first what happens if we do not have any ID. Okay, and so now we don't see any log down in our console. But if I now send the same request on this route where we have the ID, let's see what happens then. Oh, it tells me that ID is not defined. And indeed, it's not ID, so that was a stupid mistake. So it is val for value, right? So remember how I said that this value parameter is the one that will actually hold the value of the ID parameter. And so of course, that's the one that we need to then use here in order to get access to that ID. So let's try that again. And now indeed, we have tour ID is 2, right? So that log came right from this function here. Now, what I also want to show you is that this middleware function is not going to run for any of the user routes. Okay, so let's say we call users with a specific ID. So let's go ahead and copy this one here, create a new request with an ID, and let me actually save it also. So get user and save to user. And when I send it here, we of course get our standard response of this route is not defined. But you also see that we have no log like we had before. And so that is of course because this middleware function is only specified in our tour router. So in this kind of local mini application. So again, that is the analogy that I like to make. So basically that each router is kind of a mini sub application, one for each resource. Okay, and so since this middleware is only specified on this router, well, then of course it is only part of the middleware stack if we are actually inside of this sub application. Make sense? So let's suppose we have an incoming request on tours/ID. So that request will then go through all these middlewares. So first this middleware, then this one, then this middleware, then this one. So all of these are part of the middleware stack, and then it will finally hit this middleware. And since this is actually the route, it will then get into the tour router middleware. Okay, and so from there, it then goes right into this middleware, and so then this code will be run, right? And again, that's only because it has an ID in the route. If not, well, then this would simply be ignored and it would move on right to the next middleware in the stack. So these down here, right? Cool. So that is how Param Middleware works, but for now it is not really that useful, right? But we can actually use it for a very practical use case here. So let's go to our handler functions here, and you see that in all of the handler functions that actually use the ID, we check if the ID is valid, right? So we do it here in getTour, and we also do it in updateTour, so here, and in deleteTour. So all these three functions have this very similar code where they check if the ID is valid, and if not, they send back this invalid ID response. So we have all these code in the same place, and as you already know, it is not a good practice to repeat code. And so what we can do here is to use the concept of Param Middleware and perform this check here in an outside middleware that is going to run before the request even hits these handler functions. So let's go ahead and copy, or actually cut, the code from here and create a new middleware function called checkID. And of course, I also need to export that. So checkID, and we have access, request, response, next, and again, keep in mind that it is a param middleware, and so the fourth argument will be the value of the parameter. Okay, paste it here, and then don't forget to call next at the end of the middleware. All right, and what's also very important is that we have this return statement here. Okay, because if we didn't have this return here, well, then Express would send this response back, but it would still continue running the code in this function. And so after sending the response, it would then still hit this next function, and it would move on to the next middleware and would then send another response to the client. But that is really not allowed. So remember that we actually run into this error before, where it told us that we were not allowed to send headers after the response had already been sent. And so that's the kind of error that we would run into if we didn't have this return statement. Okay? So again, this makes sure that after sending this response, the function will return, so that it will finish and it will never call this next. Okay, so never forget that. But of course, we're going to do this multiple times throughout the rest of the course, and so you will get used to this kind of pattern. Okay, so let's go ahead and remove this repeated code from all of these other functions. So yeah, here we have it again. And yeah, I also want this code here just to make sure that the function is actually running. And okay, so now we can get rid of this here and replace it with our newly created controller function. So tour controller check ID. So let's check that out now. And well, again, just to make sure that it doesn't run where we do not have an ID. So we have no log here, so everything is still working on that side. And now get tour with a regular ID, so a valid ID. And so let's see. Well, we get the tour ID is log, and so that means that it did actually run or check ID middleware, right? And if we now try an invalid ID, well, then we get our invalid ID message, the 404 error code, and of course our to ID. Let's do the same with the patch. We already have an invalid ID here, and so it also runs on this one. So perfect, right? So we no longer have the check ID code in the update handler that we just invoked, basically, but still our ID is checked because we have that middleware. So this here, we have that middleware in the stack before it actually hits the update tour controller. So this middleware is now part of our pipeline, as you can imagine it. Now you might argue that we might simply create a simple function which could also check for the ID and then call that function inside of each of these tour function, and then call it inside of each of these relevant tour controllers. But that would really go against the philosophy of Express, where we should always work with the middleware stack, so with this pipeline, as much as we can. Okay, And so these functions here, they do not have to worry at all about validation. Each of these functions has only one purpose, which is to do what they say. So this one just gets the tour, this one just creates a tour, this one just updates, and this one just deletes. It doesn't check, it doesn't have to worry about any of that. Okay, and if we would now add another controller here, also depending on the ID, well, then that would automatically also check if the ID is invalid without us having to do any additional steps. Okay, so this automatically will check for the ID, and so that's really handy, and also how Express apps should work. Great, so we have another tool in our Express toolbox that we can now use in order to write our Express applications.